It's very painful to lose someone you love.
Yeah, that was my baby.
I can hear you.
I was beating on the
Great.
floor and asking God
And
to
Brian,
take this
you can
pain
hear me as
from
well?
me. I needed help. So I went to classes and found out how to be an
Thank you.
advocate. Rights are important. Everybody have rights, and a lot of people don't know they have rights.
We work with survivors who experience any kind of violence. So that might be domestic violence, sexual assault, family violence, bullying, any of those things.
I want to be sure I understand everything that happened.
And so it's very important for us to make sure that we have folks in this field who know what the community needs.
A long time ago, we never went anywhere by ourselves. We always had someone accompanying us. Nowadays, with what's going on and the trafficking of our young people, no one's walking beside them. So they're walking alone. They have nobody to witness, no one to call for help. The isolation is devastating.
Every day is something going on. Every day. Homicides. They want justice for their loved one. They want help for the pain.
When we don't address the root causes of violence, when we don't address the trauma that people experience, that's how the cycle of violence continues.
So like many of you, I am a survivor of a gun violence.
It's very important to have the voices of crime victims at the center of policy making. Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, we are a national network of about 90,000 victims of crime across the country.
Thousands of survivors getting together to be able to speak and make a change about the policies that actually affect us.
What it's about is building the next generation of leaders.
Go ahead. It has given me the ability to fight for justice.
People with disabilities are constantly fighting for rights, whether it's in transportation or education or community integration, and victim services in the criminal justice is just another area. Kathy had suggested I talk to you about some of the work that we can partner on. There's a huge amount of adaptation and accommodations that need to exist for it to even come close to having some sort of equity effect.
After I turned back around, I got hit in the head.
The Adult Advocacy Center works hard to make sure that there is representation by people with disabilities in forms of leadership, because oftentimes what we notice is that there are agencies who will say they're doing the work of working with folks who have disabilities, but they are not actually being led by folks with disabilities.
And we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll share my screen.
We all have so many different skill sets. We definitely can come together to try new and innovative approaches and to support each other because there's so much work that needs to be done.
In our Native communities, it's the voice of the people that makes the change.
All these different ways that people are exploited and taken advantage of end up sort of in this cauldron of what we now call MMIR, or murdered and missing Indigenous relatives. And we miss them.
She had went somewhere with somebody, and next thing you know, she's gone.
Are they still investigating?
They opened the case, and they're just like, oh, it's just another missing person.
We want to stop trafficking. It's not just this individual. It hurts the whole community. And the whole community needs to step forward and say, that's enough.
What does justice mean for a child or a baby who's been raped and then is groomed to be able to survive sexual torture so that people can make money off of that? Because that's me, and my voice is the sound of justice.
We have to be able to heal that spirit, because you got to heal that spirit before anything can change.
It's crucial to have Native-led solutions that are rooted in the culture, because it's through the culture that we're going to find healing.
There should be a lot of red in this quilt.
The quilt is very exciting. We can express ourselves as individuals and as a community to raise awareness around MMIR here in northern Minnesota. We're creating beauty out of tragedy, and that is justice.
It's important to make sure that our work is survivor-centered and that we listen to what they need.
All crime victims have a right to services. All crime victims have a right to heal.
Good morning and welcome everyone to this year's Crime Victim Rights Week event. We are in our 5th year of presenting inspiring keynote speakers, providing information about what the state is doing to support people impacted by crime and violence, and acknowledging the work of advocates and countless others and their efforts enforcing victims' rights, expanding services or expanding access to services, and ensuring equity and inclusion for all. My name is Rick Torrance, and I'm the Managing Director of the Office of Crime Victims Advocacy at the Department of Commerce. Today, along with the Department of Labor and Industries and the Department of Corrections, we are sponsoring this event. Crime Victims Rights Week this year is April 24th through April 30th, and it started nationally in 1981. This year, Governor Inslee has signed a proclamation acknowledging this event. And again, this year's theme is rights, access, and equity for all victims. This event is just one way of committing to ensuring that all people have access to support, healing, and the ability to reach their full potential, where all people experience autonomy, dignity, freedom of identity and expression, and safety in their homes and communities. But quickly, first, a couple of program notes. We will be discussing trauma. And for that reason, we encourage you to practice self-care, something that we call in the field, call it self-care, which means it's okay to get up, walk around, stretch, step away, doodle, whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. Second, we will ask for a little grace on the timing. We have a tremendous program today with great speakers, and we may go outside of the designated hour for this event. As I said, we're going to hear from 3 keynote speakers today who I'll introduce in a moment, and we will also give out the 2nd annual Nancy Hawley Lifetime Service Award. But first, it's important to offer a land acknowledgement. Most of us in this meeting are in Washington State. We are in the ancient homelands and traditional territories of indigenous peoples. We honor these peoples, the elders that lived here before, and the generations to come. The agencies hosting this meeting are all based in Olympia. These agencies are on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Nisqually and the Squaxin Island peoples. Olympia and South Puget Sound region are covered by the Treaty of Medicine Creek, signed in 1854 under duress by Native peoples. We are acknowledging this because it is imperative that we are intentional in our relations to the land and the people indigenous to the land. And now we will have a prayer of thanks from Brian Fresina. Brian is the Tribal Program Consultant with the State Department of Children, Youth, and Families. With over 20 years of experience in state government, he has been a driving force in both his community and workplace, promoting diversity, equality, equity, and inclusion related to all tribal nations. Brian lives in the traditional lands of the Nisqually Nation, Lacey, Washington. Brian?
First, again, thanks to the Nisqually Ops Tribe for allowing me to the Creator today for allowing us to, each and every one of us, to be here on the homelands of the Washington State tribe, from the doorway in to the doorway out, as they say when you are praying. And is that better, Matthew? And thank you. So I just want to say a prayer for each and every one of us and blessing today. And like Rick said, taking care of each and every one of ourselves today from our heart, and just a blessing from the doorway in to the doorway out. And again, I want to thank the Washington State tribes. Each and every one of us is in their homelands, for allowing us to be here today. Send them prayers and blessings, and send lots of love to each and every one of you. And again, I appreciate this few minutes to say a quick prayer. So thank you, Creator God, for us today, to be here today. I thank you for the lands that we're on. I thank you for the waters. Thank you for the food that we all intake. Thank you for the air that's there, our sacred breath. I thank you for our elders in our life, and I thank you for our children, and send prayers to all of them, and thank you for allowing me to do this today.
Thank you, Brian. Really appreciate that. Now we'll turn to our first keynote speaker. That would be Jorge Barón. Jorge has served as the executive director of the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project since April of 2008, having previously worked as a staff attorney for that organization for 2 years. The Northwest Immigrant Rights Project is a nationally recognized legal services organization dedicated solely to advancing and defending the rights of low-income immigrants. Jorge's passion for this work is firmly rooted in his own immigrant experience. He is originally from Bogota, Colombia, and immigrated to the United States when he was 13. Jorge is a graduate of Yale Law School and Duke University, and it is my honor to introduce to you Jorge Barón.
Thank you so much, Rick, for that kind introduction. And I also want to express my appreciation to Matthew and everyone else who has worked so hard to put together this event today. And I want to also express my gratitude to all of you who are working and serving survivors across the state every day. As you heard from Rick, my name is Jorge Barón. I've had the privilege to serve as the executive director of Northwest Immigrant Rights Project for going on 14 years now. And I wanted to share a bit about our organization so you understand the perspective that I'm bringing to this meeting today. As you heard, and we call it NIRP. We use that acronym instead of the long Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. We're a nonprofit legal services organization that provides assistance to individuals and families navigating our complex immigration system. We have 4 offices around the state, 2 offices in Eastern Washington, in Wenatchee and Granger in the Yakima Valley, an office in Tacoma, and then our main office where I'm today in Seattle. While we provide services in a number of areas in the area of immigration, a significant portion of our work is serving immigrant survivors of crime to access a number of humanitarian protections that allow them to be able to pursue generally permanent protection here in the United States when they are deemed eligible for that. My goal today is to share a little bit about the perspective on some of the specific challenges that, from our perspective, we see many of our immigrant survivors' clients face. I know many of you already work and support immigrant survivors, and I'm deeply grateful for that service. So some of this information may not be new to you. But my hope is that reinforcing some of this information about the challenges that immigrant survivors in particular, and particularly I will focus today talking about our experiences supporting undocumented survivors of crime in our communities, will help us all collectively achieve the goal that I think is expressed in this week's, in the National Crime Victims Rights Week's theme for this year, which is rights, access, equity for all victims. And for the communities that we're serving, I would want to add all victims, no matter where those victims happen to be born. So when I thought about the best way to illustrate some of those challenges that many of our clients experience, I thought the best way to do that was to share the story of one of our clients, one of my former clients that I had the privilege of working with, Ileana. And Ileana has given us permission to share her story. She, after the story that I will share with you, wanted to make sure that others hear about what occurred to her, in the hope that we might be able to prevent some of the situations that she faced. I met Ileana when I was a staff attorney working out of our Tacoma office, and a lot of that work involved supporting people who found themselves in immigration detention, who were detained by immigration authorities in the detention center that many of you may know in Tacoma right now. It's now known as the Northwest ICE Processing Center, but for much of its history, it's been known as the Northwest Detention Center. I walked in, a lot of our work there, and still to this day, is to provide support to people who are there, who are facing deportation hearings, or who may be facing more imminent deportation. So I went in to meet with Ileana to find out about her story. And what she shared with me is that she had come to the United States at a young age. And she was a teenager when she first came to the United States. She came by herself, even though she was a minor. And this is an experience that many of our client communities experience, having come to the United States at a very young age. Started working here, was living with a relative. Eventually, she ended up working at this restaurant where there was an immigration raid, and she was placed in deportation proceedings. Started working with a lawyer that has since been disbarred. Had a lot of challenges with that case, but the case was pending. She wasn't detained at the time, and so she continued her effort to try to remain here in the United States, pursuing an asylum claim. Later, as this case was kind of unfolding, she ended up in a relationship with a partner that was deeply abusive to her. She had a child with this partner, and despite all of the abuse that was happening, she was afraid of contacting law enforcement or seeking help, which is one of the things that I will talk about some of the challenges that our clients experience. The abuse got so bad that at a certain point, the neighbors called law enforcement, and they intervened. In fact, the perpetrator of the abuse, or the partner, ended up going to prison because of how severe the abuse had been. And Ileana went to a shelter to get support with her at the time young child. And she was just kind of being able to get back on, get the support she needed, and she was kind of putting her life back together after all of those experiences. She was dropping off her child at school one September morning, and was stopped at a light on the east side here in King County, when another car rear-ended her. She was just stopped at a light, and this car kind of missed the light and hit her in her vehicle. And she was actually not that hurt. She was a little shaken up, but the police came to investigate. And when they ran her information from her driver's license through the database, they found out that she had a deportation order. So even though she had not had any fault in the situation at all, she was detained, she was arrested, and she was transferred to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And that's how she ended up at the Tacoma Detention Center. Now, she actually didn't know that she had this deportation order. She thought her case was still pending. During the time that she had been in the shelter, she had lost touch with her attorney. And so she had no idea that her case had concluded, and that she was now facing kind of imminent deportation. So when she showed up to the detention center, she asked the immigration officials whether she could, be released. She was concerned about, of course, her daughter, who is now had been left behind at school, and who is going to take care of her. But the immigration officials said that because she now had a final deportation order, she wasn't going to chance to go before the judge, and she had no chance of being released. So she asked if she could, talk to an attorney. And unfortunately, they told her that she could hire an attorney, but if otherwise, that's the only way. And she didn't have any money at the time to hire an attorney, so they gave her a list of legal service providers, and that's how she ended up being connected to us. And that's why I met with her there at the detention center. And so when I talked to her, she shared with me about the circumstances in her case, and I explained to her that because she had been a victim of some serious abuse, and had actually cooperated in the investigation of this, that she might be eligible for a form of protection called a U visa, which is one of the protections available under our immigration laws. But I shared with her that it would be challenging at this point because she already had a deportation order, and that ICE could really deport her at any time, and that even if we pursued this option, it might be a couple of months before she could potentially be released if everything worked out in her favor. She was very distraught about the possibility of having to be detained for that period of time, and so she initially told me that she couldn't stay detained and didn't want to fight the case, especially when it wasn't clear that it was for certain that she would be able to stay. So, that's a very common situation. I left, and later I got a call the next morning, and she said, "I changed my mind. I want to fight this case." So I came back to the detention center and met with her. And I remember very clearly this conversation because I asked her what led her to change her mind, and she told me, that night she was thinking about her daughter and what the challenges would be for her. And the decision that she would have to make of whether to leave her child who was born in the US and so could stay here as a US citizen, or whether she would take her child with her to where she was from originally in Central America, but where she had left because of abuse that she had experienced, and where, of course, that child would have a lot fewer opportunities. And she realized that she didn't want to make that choice. Either one of those choices seemed unacceptable to her, and that the only way that she could stay here in the United States with her daughter was by trying to fight this case and try to pursue that EU visa protection. So we started working on her case, and I'm grateful to say that it did take us 2 to 3 months to be able to get her released from detention, but she was able to obtain the EU visa protection and ultimately become a permanent resident and is living here with her daughter and didn't have to make that choice. So despite all of that, we see it as a positive story of the fact that she was able to remain, and Ileana was able to stay here in our communities. But I share that story to highlight a few issues that I think are important for all of us to remember and recognize when working with immigrant survivors of crime, and particularly with survivors who don't currently have permanent immigration status, who are undocumented. So the first one, of course, was the fear that Ileana experienced in trying to seek support in law enforcement and services. When I talked to her about that situation and the reasons that she had not initially contacted, despite all of that she was facing, she shared about the fact that she was scared of the fact that, even though she had already been in deportation proceedings, she was worried that contacting law enforcement, the experience that she'd had with law enforcement had been with immigration officials, and she was very fearful of doing that. And so she took, she basically had refused to do that. And interestingly, even after this whole experience and the fact that the intervention of the criminal justice system had helped her in her specific situation, even later she was still afraid when I talked to her because of the later experience that she had regarding the car accident, because her experience was that it was local law enforcement that had essentially turned her over to immigration officials. And so I think it's just important for us to understand that dynamic because a lot of people are fearful of contacting support in the community because of the threat that they perceive that will result in their deportation. And in some cases, that fear is justified. Not every time, of course, and there's a lot of work that has been done to kind of keep immigration enforcement, particularly in our state, separate from local law enforcement, from immigration enforcement, but the fear is still there, and I think that's important for us to remember. The other fear that a lot of our community members experience is the fact that if they're going to seek support, if they're going to seek help, that this is going to hurt them in their chances to pursue some sort of permanent protection in the future, that they're going to not going to be able to apply for green cards or something like that. And that fear has been exacerbated because of some work by the prior federal administration on an issue called the public charge rule that exacerbated that fear. And so that's something that for the most part is actually not a justified fear, because immigrant survivors and people who've been survivors of crime who access public benefits that they qualify for are not going to be penalized under our immigration policy. But a lot of folks don't know that, and they think that that is going to be the case, and that is something that we have to work on to cure. The other issue that a lot of our clients experience is issues with language access. A lot of immigrant survivors obviously are not native English speakers, and so they are afraid of contacting services. We also hear from people that they're afraid that they're not going to be able to access services in their language, and something that we absolutely need to work on. And I know there's a lot of work happening in that area as well. The other thing that I wanted to highlight that I know Ileana experienced a lot was the lack of access to work and economic supports. And for undocumented survivors in particular, this can be a huge barrier. One of my other clients that I worked with and Ileana as well, shared like part of the reason that led them to not report the abuse was because they were afraid of what would happen to them economically if they did report the abuse, because they didn't feel they didn't have work authorization, they didn't have a work permit, they weren't sure they would be able to work, and also would not have access to economic benefits, to economic supports that other community members might in a period where they don't have that support. And I will say that there are some supports at the federal level for immigrant survivors once they actually qualify for protections like the U visa. But some of those provisions, like right now, it's taking 6 years for somebody to actually be able to be identified as actually to get approved for a visa. And so a lot of survivors are during that period when they're applying, don't have that support. I will say that I'm very proud that here in Washington State, we have been leaders in recognizing these barriers. And so state legislature a couple of years ago approved a bill called Senate Bill 5164 that actually expanded access to benefits. And it actually just went into effect in the last couple months. So that's an important policy that is going to ensure that survivors here and immigrant survivors who would not otherwise be eligible for certain economic supports during the time that they're pursuing protections at the federal level will have those supports from state-based benefits. Now, they may not be the same level as federal benefits, but it is going to be an important difference, and one that I hope everybody's aware of because this is a new benefit that just came online. So my time is up, but I again want to just echo the message about thinking through as we serve survivors on all of the specific challenges that some of our survivor communities and victims of crime across the state will need, and particularly ask you to reinforce efforts to support policies like SB 5164 that are going to make sure that all survivors have equitable access to what they need to thrive and to heal. And so again, I want to thank you for all the work that you're doing. I want to thank again our deep partnership with the Office of Crime Victims Advocacy and all of the state partners here and throughout the state that are supporting survivors, including immigrant survivors of crime. So thank you, and I look forward to all of the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jorge. And I might add that another piece of legislation that passed a couple years ago was the Safety and Access for Immigrant Victims Act, which I know that Jorge and other advocates had a great role or hand in playing or getting passed. That's administered by the Department of Commerce Office of Crime Victims Advocacy, and you can find more information about that program on our website. Once again, thank you, Jorge. Now we'll turn to our next speaker, Professor Meg Garvin. Meg is the professor at Lewis and Clark Law School in Oregon and executive director of the National Crime Victim Law Institute. She's a leading expert on victims' rights. Her list of credentials, actions, and awards would take up too much time today, so I will just say that it is extensive, and to say that she is nationally recognized for her contributions to preventing and responding to sexual assault in the military, and has testified before Congress on that issue. So thank you so much for joining us, Professor Meg Garvin.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here with everyone today and very grateful. I plan to talk about three things. My topic is victims' rights enforcement. And in fact, I'm going to talk about each of those things distinctly: victims, rights, and enforcement. But before I start, I am not in Washington, and I want to take a moment to honor the lands on which I live and work. I am based in Portland, Oregon, and I live and work on the traditional and ancestral homelands of many peoples, including the Multnomah, the Kathlamet, the Clackamas, the Tumwater, the Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapua, and many others who are indigenous nations of the Columbia River. And I am incredibly grateful and honored to get to live on their lands. Before I jump in too far to talk about victims' rights and enforcement, I want to tell you a little bit about my agency. I am with the National Crime Victim Law Institute, which is a nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon, which is where I'm also a law professor. The National Crime Victim Law Institute, you might be wondering, why is someone from Oregon talking to all of us who do the hard work in Washington? Well, not only am I a neighbor to you, but my agency, NCVLI, we work with advocates and community-based and system-based, law enforcement, prosecutors, civil attorneys, immigration attorneys, community partners, health providers, anyone who interacts with survivors. We work with them all over the country with the intention of restoring or creating power for survivors. Our focus of our work is creating a better legal system for victims, and our specific expertise is the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system. We were founded because our original executive director, who was a former prosecutor, took note that even on his best day being a prosecutor, the survivors of crime with whom he worked sometimes came out worse from their interaction with criminal justice. They came out the other side of the system with increased post-traumatic stress symptoms rather than decreased. They came out with less faith in system rather than more faith in system. And so we were founded back in the late 1990s and formally established in 2000 in order to think about how can we empower and create enhanced agency, not just autonomy, but agency for survivors, right? Agency is the notion of not only do you get to choose amongst options that are provided to you, but you get to be the architect of the choices themselves and then choose amongst them. So in thinking about our legal systems and in thinking about how they are currently structured, one of the ways in which we were established to start enhancing agency for survivors was to give them independent legal counsel as they navigated a system which had traditionally excluded them, or at least in the most recent 100 years excluded them, and that is the criminal justice system. That system in the last 100 years, not in our colonial times, right, when North America was taken over, but in times since then, post-constitutional creation of the United States, victims started to be excluded from criminal justice. And so we were founded, NCVLI was founded to say, how do we restore agency in that system which has been excluding victims? And the key for us around the why of that is that because not only did our executive director take note of the victimization or re-victimization that survivors encountered in that system, but research supported that. Research supported that when victims are disempowered as they navigate that system, they have increased trauma symptoms. They have decreased faith in the system. So that's why we were founded. And the core of what we do is victims' rights enforcement. So let me unpack that. And the reason is because we find that each of those words matters so much. So I'm going to start with victims, right? And it might seem very basic, but I'm going to ask all of us. Many of us were trained in grammar, right? From a young age, if you were educated domestically here and had access to educational systems, many of us in our early grade school opportunities had access to understanding punctuation. And you might be thinking, where on earth is Meg going with this? But for us, it comes down to this: victims' rights enforcement. If all of us who have access to this way of thinking, right, can in our mind's eye or on a sheet of paper visualize or write victims' rights enforcement, but just focus on victims and write it or visualize it. What does it look like? Well, hopefully what it looks like is a word with an apostrophe. Victims' rights enforcement, the word victim, the starting point of agency, of empowerment, says that word must have an apostrophe on it before we get to rights. Because if we do not have an apostrophe there, then victim is an adjective or an extra word. But when it has an apostrophe, in the English language, an apostrophe can mean a contraction, of course, but fundamentally what it means in this context is ownership. The victim, the individual human being, owns whatever comes after that if there's an apostrophe. And if rights come after that, if it is victim apostrophe S rights, then that individual human being owns the right. And that matters. It matters because when someone owns something, we must and should ask them, what do you want to do with that? How do you want to activate that? How do you want to be involved in moments that might impact that? And when that is rights, that's fundamental to how the victim can navigate their life after they've been harmed, right? So victims, starting with victims and ensuring that there's an apostrophe on it whenever we're talking about victims' rights or victims' rights enforcement becomes fundamentally important. And we have to also make sure that the word itself is inclusive, right? Too often, we have let the word victim be a narrow idea of who's the victim. And so then the apostrophe, even when it was there, excluded a whole lot of our community from activating rights, because what we did was have a narrow definition of victim and either no apostrophe or an apostrophe that only attached to a few, right? So victims, that word must be a broad understanding of who's included, and it has to have an apostrophe. And then we move on to rights. So what can they own? How do we build agency in a system that traditionally has excluded? Well, rights have to be broad, right? They have to be things that allow victims to have privacy, protection, and participation, kind of the 4 Ps. The fourth one being property, but I'm not going to have a time to talk about that one. But privacy, protection, and participation from the moment of harm all the way through their lives, because we're surviving our whole lives, right? After an incident, there's often pre and then my life, right? And I need to learn to survive. So privacy, protection, and participation in all the moments that that have impact on my surviving. So rights have to be broad. The Federal Crime Victims' Rights Act is a wonderful model of legislation that has a lot of rights. I would encourage us to look at that and to see, are there gaps in Washington state law? And I would argue there are. Right? There are gaps in Oregon state law. We need to turn towards those gaps and see what rights are not present, and when are we having those rights attach? Who has the power and the authority to say when they attach? Is it only after charges are filed? Well, goodness, what we know is that not a lot of things make it all the way through charging, let alone prosecution. And so then whole swaths of our community who thought they were promised rights don't have rights, at least not these rights. And so turning to the notion of rights and ensuring that they are broad and that they attach early becomes incredibly important. Also ensuring that there's a lot of shall rather than may in those rights, meaning that the system shall afford the rights, not that there's discretion embedded in giving them. Right? If we're going to empower, if victims are going to be a part of our process, then they have to own the rights, and they have to own them in a way that no one else gets to take them away through discretion. That might mean revising some of our laws, right? And I'm happy, and NCBLA is happy to talk about what that can look like. And all across the country, we're doing this work of improving the rights. So let's move to, once you have victims broadly and an apostrophe, and they have rights, what is enforcement? What's the third word? Well, enforcement is so critical to our work and the work of what we're doing this week and every day that you do each day of the year, because rights are just words on paper, right? Rights are just words on paper until we activate them, until we hold systems accountable, until someone can say, I have a right, and systems have to respond to that, right? And there's two ways, right? There's compliance with rights, which systems create opportunities to ensure that we comply with rights. We set up automatic notification of rights, right? We have Vine systems, we have forms, we have ways that we create the system can try to comply with rights. Enforcement, though, goes back to that apostrophe. Enforcement is about the idea that I, as an individual human being, I, as the individual victim with the apostrophe, I get to say, I'm here to either the prosecution, to law enforcement, or most importantly, to a court. I say, I am here, I have a right, and I would like you, court, to enforce that. And you might be thinking, well, there isn't a place for that in criminal justice. And what I will tell you is there is. NCVLI has been doing independent legal advocacy in criminal courts since the year 2000, all across the country. We have sexual cases, domestic violence cases, homicide cases, stalking, fraud, child abuse, trafficking. In every one of those moments, when the rights are there, victims can activate them in court. And that is so important to the apostrophe, to ensure that there's no co-opting of survivor voice, that no one else in the system, even the best intentioned, take a survivor's voice. Instead, in creating space for survivors' voices in system and allowing them to ask for the rights of the court and demanding the court to enforce them, empowers, right? And quite honestly, the system might not always like, right, this approach. All across the country, I receive pushback on victims' rights enforcement, victims having their own lawyer to help them do this, right? Because we provide no-cost legal services to help them do this. And we get pushback. The system will be slower. The system only has two tables, prosecution and the defense. The system has challenges with this. I absolutely understand those challenges. But to have a more accountable system, to have a system that builds community, to have a system that allows us to build an approach that achieves the vision of rights, equity, and access for all victims, and I'd really say for each victim, right? For each victim requires us to listen to survivors and to create space for them in the system to share their own voices. That's victims' rights enforcement. And I often call it a beautiful cacophony, right? Because not every survivor is going to agree. Not every survivor is going to like the way the system is going. Not every survivor is going to hate the system, right? We have a beautiful cacophony of resilience in our community, and we have to create the space for it. And victims' rights enforcement is the next step of the victims' rights movement, right? It is return the apostrophe or add the apostrophe to a broad notion of victim, ensure the rights are broad, and then move to enforcement, which allows for legal advocacy, independent legal advocacy by the victim through counsel in criminal legal processes, right? And that requires us to really pause and rethink, how do we do that? How do we ensure that there is that access? I am happy that we are turning towards this. I am happy that we're thinking about rights, access, and equity for all victims and for each victim. And I really hope that as we continue to move forward, we get that apostrophe in for every single victim, and we start to create space for them in our legal system through legal advocacy and rights enforcement. So I know my time is up. I am really honored to be here and to be on this panel, and I cannot wait for our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Professor Garvin. That was truly inspiring. Heartfelt thank you. And speaking of our next speaker, that would be Dr. Karen Johnson. Dr. J, as she is known, is the founding director of the Washington State Office of Equity. Dr. Johnson was also the first Equity and Inclusion Administrator for the Washington State Department of Corrections, one of our co-sponsors today. Last year at this event, we welcomed the creation of the Washington State Office of Equity as an important step in addressing the impacts of inequity in the response to crime and violence. As we planned this year's event, we thought, wow, it would be so great if we could have Dr. J join us, and she has graciously agreed to do that. Before I call her on, though, I want to say a couple things that come from the pledge of the Office of Equity. The Office of Equity pledges to partner with others to be a fully inclusive, multicultural, anti-racist state, to transform our government enterprise into one that embeds equity and justice into every action. Furthermore, it states, doing this requires the elimination of systemic barriers that have been deeply entrenched in systems of inequality and oppression. It is critical that we understand our response to crime and violence in this perspective, and that is why it is so great to have Dr. Johnson with us today. Dr. J?
Thank you, Rick, for the introduction and Matt for the invitation to join you today at the 2022 National Crime Victims with an apostrophe, thank you, Meg, Rights Week event, commemoration, celebration, call to action. Listening to Jorge and Meg has me in a place, and so while I have thoughts I would like to share today, I choose to speak from the heart today. Anything can happen, and I hope I can do it within time, because this is very important to me, personally and professionally. I come to you today live from the lands, time immemorial, of the Coast Salish, Cowlitz, Nisqually, and Squaxin Island peoples. I first want to thank each and every one of you at the sound of my voice, advocates for the work that you do to help crime victims, apostrophe, S apostrophe. You know, 40 years ago, the President's Task Force on Victims of Crime issued a landmark report that guided the creation of victims' rights and established the professionalism of the victims' services field. Today, the movement, as you know better than I, encompasses thousands of advocacy and service organizations, such as those that you here represent today. And they address the full continuum of victims' needs, many of which were just beginning to come into focus in the 1970s and 1980s. Yet in the 21st century and 2022, many of you still struggle to ensure that survivors receive updated case status notifications and information about their options in the justice system. Where is the justice? Where is the agency that Meg spoke about? Well, it comes through your advocacy. Thank you. Many people who experience crime in underserved communities are unaware that help, including crime victim compensation, is available. How then are their rights enforced? Again, through your advocacy. We must all do all we can to ensure that access to victim assistance and compensation services for all people who experience victimization, and providing multiple avenues for help, because we know that every experience is unique, as Jorge elaborated on earlier, and that one approach does not fit all. We are fundamentally human beings. So as I was reflecting on this year's theme, rights, access, equity for all victims, I was struck by the fact that it really underscores the importance of enforcing victims' rights, expanding access to services, and ensuring equity and inclusion for all. And I was asked to speak to you for a few minutes today about ensuring equity and inclusion for all. And Meg, thank you, because words do matter. And the Office of Equity does not focus on inclusion. We focus on belonging. Why? Because fundamentally the question is inclusion into what? Into an oppressive, racist, misogynistic system? We don't think so. We perceive and believe that each and every one of us belongs here, has a right to be here, and is entitled by virtue of our humanity access to the privileges and benefits that come with being a member in society. And so the Washington State Office of Equity, we were established in April 2020 within the Office of the Governor for the purpose of promoting access to equitable opportunities, power, and resources that reduce disparities statewide and improve outcomes for people across state government. And we envision everyone in the state having full access to the opportunities, the power, and resources that they need to flourish and achieve their full potential. And by statute, our office must be guided by 3 principles of equity. Like Meg, I'm going to say I'm going somewhere here with this. First, everything we do must be guided by this principle, that we're developing, strengthening, and supporting policies and procedures that distribute and prioritize resources to those who have been and currently are marginalized and or oppressed. Number 2, all of our work in the Office of Equity must be about eliminating systemic barriers that have been deeply entrenched in systems of inequality and oppression. And the third thing we must be mindful of as we go about our work is to ensure that equity achieves procedural and outcome fairness, promoting dignity, honor, and respect for all people. How on earth would one expect someone who has been traumatized and victimized to navigate a broken system? Well, that now gets to my passion for the work that I do. You see, I'm passionate about centering equity and belonging for all in a system that was created to dehumanize, vilify, victimize, and criminalize black people first and foremost, and other people of color. We want to center equity and belonging so everyone can thrive and heal, as Jorge said. Why? Because, see, racism is not healthy for anyone, the oppressed or the oppressor. And people carry this generational trauma in their bodies. And the work that we do is critical to understanding a crime and violence in a system that was historically oppressive and systematically exclusive. So what's going to happen next? Well, on March 21st, Governor Jay Inslee signed Executive Order 2204. Many of you might be familiar with it. If not, you can Google it, it's online. Implementing the Washington State Pro-Equity Anti-Racism Ecosystem, our Plan and Playbook, or PAIR. These are pairs. I keep the vision in front of me. PAIR, Plan and Playbook. And this is key in our strategy for becoming an equitable and just Washington, because the Plan and Playbook focuses our work on eliminating disparities in 15 determinants of equity. And King County defined determinants of equity as those driving factors that impact the overall quality of life for all Washingtonians. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because one of the 15 determinants of equity is equity in justice systems and laws. So we seek equity in justice systems and laws deeply rooted in oppression, including our response to crime and violence, victims of crimes, and those victimized into committing the crimes in the first place. When we say equity and justice for all, we mean for all, and we are really about restorative justice. Because according to Cornel West, justice is what love looks like in person. And this is very personal to me because, you see, I have a brother youngest brother, spoiled would be my word, made bad, who had no responsibility and no accountability, and he was a beautiful child and was just literally able to get away with murder. And when my mother passed away, because he was a mama's boy and the baby, he certainly had not learned any coping skills. And the way he chose to show up is he actually committed murder. And so when I was asked about this, now that seemed a little bit dramatic and traumatic and out there even for my brother, for me. So when I was asked about it by the U.S. Marshals, I'm like, well, certainly that doesn't sound like my brother. Now, granted, he certainly has gotten away with all kinds of things because my grandparents always got him out of trouble, but he doesn't have a propensity to kill anyone. Well, actually, he did. And what happened was, Long story very, very short, the grandson of the person that he murdered reached out to him in prison and wanted to understand why. And when my brother attempted to bring closure and healing to a family member traumatized by his highly inappropriate behavior, he was denied the opportunity to bring healing and justice to that family for whom he took a loved one. So, of course, he reached out to me. And in the process of helping him navigate that system, he was never successful in being able to bring healing to himself, to share to that family member what he did and why he did what he did for their loved one that is no longer with them. You know, I don't know about you, but my grandparents played a significant role in my life. And I can't imagine having my grandparents taken away from me when I was young, which is what my brother did. And then to be a grandchild and not even have the love of my grandmother because someone took her life, and wanting to know why, and not being able to receive that answer. Where is the equity and justice for all? Where is the equity and justice for that family? Where is the equity and justice for my brother? And so the call to action that I would issue to all of us today is to think about the fact that in a system that is designed to oppress and systematically exclude people based on skin color, and I don't know what the data is. I don't know how many black and brown and native people are incarcerated, but according to Michelle Alexander and others, we are now in a place where our nation is referred to as the new Jim Crow, where segregation was legalized, the age of mass incarceration. Because you see, although the 13th Amendment in 1863 abolished slavery, it was except for circumstances of crimes, let's say. And that is why I'm wondering if, even as we think about victims' rights and access, who is really the victim? Clearly, those like Jorge was talking about in our domestic violence case absolutely are victimized, don't get me wrong. But if the perpetrators of the crime have also been victimized, dehumanized, vilified, and criminalized, my question then becomes, what is it going to take for all of us to achieve that justice and healing that we all seek? And my question fundamentally is, imagine if this was a nation of all white people. Would we be the nation that is the poster child, if you will, for mass incarceration in the new Jim Crow? Well, when looking at Norway, which is a predominantly white nation, no, they don't have the data and the crime and the victimization that we experience. And perhaps if we went about our work thinking, what would we do if these were white people? Maybe, just maybe, we could begin to unlock the trauma that all of us have experienced so that we can ensure equity, justice, belonging for all, so that everyone has access to what they need when they've been victimized, don't have to go through a system that further brings trauma on people who have been victims, so that we don't even have to be mindful of the apostrophe, because we'll be working and living in a society that centers all humanity, and we understand that we rise and fall together. We understand that we are each and everyone's neighbor. We understand that each and every person deserves to be treated with love and dignity, humanity, and respect, so that this entire conversation, this entire week, will be eliminated 100 years from now, because we will be in a society where we give honor and space and place to ensure that everyone has the rights to be human, access to what they need to thrive and flourish and achieve their full potential, and there's equity and justice for all. That would be my call to action for each and every one of us as we continue to navigate this space together in this ecosystem called Earth, where we are living and breathing and in community. Ubuntu would be the word from the Bantu language, which means that we focus on the interconnectedness of humanity. You might have heard it as I am because we are, therefore I am. And the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. put it even more clearly when he said, what affects one directly affects all indirectly. Let's begin to be interdependent toward love, interdependent toward justice, interdependent until we get there in utopia to begin to look at the system that we designed, dismantle it, so people do not have to navigate our broken system.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. I'm sure you've heard this before, but that is difficult to follow, but I'm going to do my best. Very inspiring, and thank you again. I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about what we traditionally call the state of the state part of the presentation. Over the years, we have centered this presentation on the need for collaboration, not just between the host agencies here, but to expand that partnership. And we want to share some of the current efforts in addressing the needs of those impacted by crime and violence in all of its forms. Several years ago, we shared the status that almost 10,000 sexual assault forensic examination kits were not submitted for testing. Each one of those, of course, belonging to an individual who agreed to, after experiencing sexual assault, to undergo further trauma of a sexual assault examination. And each one of those, every individual one of them, were failed by the system. This is what Professor Garvin referred to as re-victimization. Thankfully, the state and folks, advocates and legislators noticed this, and they created the Sexual Assault Forensic Examination Advisory Group. Administered by the Attorney General's Office. It included law enforcement, prosecutors, advocates, legislators, state agencies, including Commerce and the State Patrol, and perhaps most importantly, survivors. And that advisory group's recommendations were taken to the legislature, and as a result of that, there are new laboratories, new forensic lab scientists, a tracking system for all kits, the right for victims to know where their kit is and its testing status, trauma-informed training for law enforcement, detectives that investigate sexual assault, funding for a new forensic nurse training program at the Washington State University, and stipends for nurses taking that training to encourage them to remove barriers for them to get that training. As a result, so far, 9,000 of those kits have been submitted for testing, with over 6,000 completely tested. And again, I mentioned we have a tracking system so that individuals who undergo that additional trauma of a forensic examination know where their kit is at any time. Somewhat relatedly, legislation enacted in 2021 enabled the Crime Victim Compensation Program, administered by Labor and Industries, to pay for forensic examinations that included non-fatal strangulation. No costs associated with that examination shall be borne by the individual for this potentially life-saving procedure. Additionally, Labor and Industries are tracking the use of that funding to ensure that funding for other services is not impacted. In addition, L&I, as I mentioned, manages the Crime Victim Compensation Program. Last year, they received more than 4,500 claims from crime victims and distributed nearly $15 million in support. They also paid for more than 3,500 sexual assault exams. I mentioned that I'm with the Office of Crime Victims Advocacy. One of our main roles at OCVA is to fund services and advocacy for individuals impacted by crime and violence across the state. And we do that by providing funding to local governments, tribes, and nonprofits. Last year, we granted more than $50 million to those entities, And those entities provided over 350,000 hours of advocacy and services to more than 50,000 people impacted by crime and violence. Our largest source of funding is the Victims of Crime Act. And unfortunately, that funding is somewhat volatile. To give you an example, in 2017, we received $70 million for the 2017 award, and then in 2020, it was much closer to 30. Due to the collaborative efforts of advocates, stakeholders, legislators, and the governor's office, and I'm probably leaving out some, the last two state budgets included about $22 million to help mitigate those reductions. In addition, in the most recent legislative year, Commerce and OCVA received funding to help support the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and then also housing vouchers for victims of human trafficking. And then finally, our third partner, the Washington State Department of Corrections, their victim service program provides notifications in advance of the release of incarcerated individuals. And they have more than 9,500 individuals enrolled in that program. They also respond to specific threats and safety concerns, of which last year there were over 250 of those. So that is the state of the state. Thank you to everybody that had a role in all of those great accomplishments. And then we're going to turn to a very special time, a very special part of our event. This is the presentation of the Nancy Hawley Lifetime Service Award. The award recognizes a victim advocate who has demonstrated a lifetime of experience, exceptional service to victims of crime, and made significant contributions to the victim advocacy field in Washington State. Nancy Hawley started her advocacy career working with young people at the Deaconess Children's Service Teen Parent Program. She then became one of the original community victim liaisons at the Department of Corrections. And when she left that, she became the director of the Family and Friends of Violent Crime organization, which is now known as Victim Support Services. These are just a couple of her many achievements. And she died peacefully August 20, 2020, at the age of 60. I now have the pleasure of introducing two folks that are going to introduce the winner of this year's award. First is Steve Ekstrom, who started working at the State Department of Corrections in December of 2001, initially on loan from my agency. He was an employee at the Office of Crime Victims Advocacy. He ended up designing the community victim liaison positions at corrections, and eventually, and also the initial training, and then he ended up as the program manager until he retired 16 years later. Jackie Nelson is a community victim liaison with corrections. In 2003, she accepted the position with the Victim Services Program. She maintains direct contact with community stakeholders and victims, offering information about the program services and assists in enrollment for notifications regarding upcoming releases. In 2017, Jackie accepted her current crime victim liaison position, providing direct services and safety planning for victims in Pierce, Thurston, and Mason counties. She is actively involved in the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Task Force committees in Thurston and Mason counties. Steve and Jackie, please tell us about our award winners.
Thank you, Rick. We are today going to confer the Nancy Hawley Lifetime Service Award upon Sheila Llewellyn in recognition and honor of her career of commitment to advocacy for victims of crime. Why do we honor a career of service in the field of victim advocacy? It can be a very rewarding profession, but it is often a very demanding one. You're helping people with great needs in very tangible ways, but you're also exposed on a daily basis to the consequences of some of the worst of human behavior. And for those who do this work in a criminal justice agency, you are working in a setting in which meeting the needs of crime victims is not the first organizational priority. So for those who stick with it, it often evolves into a calling as much as a career path. They provide continuity to the field, a kind of institutional memory that extends beyond the particular work setting. And they help develop newcomers to the field through training and mentorship. And so we honor the lifetime of service from which we and those we serve all benefit.
Sheila began her work with victims in 1979 as the legal advocate for the Women's Domestic Violence Shelter Program, now known as Safe Place, in Olympia. In 1983, she developed the Victim Witness Program at the Thurston County Prosecutor's Office, where she worked for 21 years. Sheila then moved to the Department of Corrections, where she was hired as a community victim liaison. She also held positions as a treatment provider and victim liaison to the Indeterminate Sentence Review Board. In 2019, Sheila became the program manager for the department's Victim Services Program. She held this position for 3 years before her retirement in February of 2022. As the program manager, Sheila managed the statewide operations of the Victim Services Program, led the process of facilitated dialogues between victims, survivors, and individuals in custody, and also managed the department's accountability letter bank. Sheila is a licensed mental health counselor and holds a Master's of Arts in Counseling Psychology. She was an adjunct professor at St. Martin's University for 12 years, where she taught victimology. Sheila completed an internship as a domestic violence treatment provider, designed and facilitated an empowerment for women group for survivors of domestic violence, and served on a domestic violence fatality review board for Thurston County. Sheila has led a career advocating for community safety and crime victims. She demonstrates a history of helping others, educating others, mentoring, and empowering others, and shows compassion and pride for a career spent doing something she loves. Sheila is a leader and committed advocate. She is a compassionate mother, friend, and spouse who inspires others.
One of the things I often found myself doing around this time of year was admonishing my children that even though the warming days of spring are here and the end of the school year is in sight, it's not a time to coast, it's time to finish strong. Now, I didn't specifically talk to Sheila about finishing strong, but in fact she did in a way that is going to extend her service, I think, in a very tangible way into the future. She was the primary moving force, I think, behind the passage of Senate Bill 5245 in the most recently completed session, which will expand notification to victims of a number of offenses that hadn't been covered and provided with that service previously, filled in some real gaps that met a real need for people, and which will provide them with some additional time to plan for their safety before the person that victimized them is released from prison. So I think in a very tangible way, her lifetime of service extends beyond that career and well into the future. So Sheila, I'd like you to step forward if you would. And it's our honor here to present you with the Nancy Hawley Lifetime Service Award for 2022. Well earned and well deserved. Congratulations.
Thank you. Good morning. When I began my career in victim advocacy, I don't think it was considered a career option. It was a group of women across the country, a grassroots effort by women who believed that everyone should be safe in their own home, and that assaulting a loved one should be given the same seriousness as assaulting a stranger. And so from there, we began doing the work of trying to advocate for victims within the court system. Since that time, things have expanded, and there are many more opportunities in this field. Over the years, any time that anybody found out what I did for a living, the most common response was, "How can you do that? I could never do that." And it is very challenging work. It can be very frustrating, it can be heartbreaking, and it's also very rewarding. And I have never regretted my decision to move forward and work in this field. There are times when you wonder if you made a difference, and we don't always hear that we made a difference. People who are traumatized and you're sitting with them in their pain are not always very articulate or polite. They sometimes say thank you. They sometimes tell you you made a difference, but many times you just don't know. And one day a woman approached me on the street and said to me, "Thank you for what you said to me 2 years ago. I had no idea what you were talking about, but I get it now." And it occurred to me, I didn't know who this woman was. I had no idea what I'd said to her. I just always tried to be compassionate, supportive, and say healthy things. And so it occurred to me that I plant seeds. I'm not responsible for whether or not they grow. And that became my mantra. The other thing I recognized doing this work is that there's a need for balance. I often covered multiple counties. For 3 years, I covered the entire state. And I knew of every tragedy in the communities I covered. I also knew the superheroes, the advocates, the first responders, the other helpers and angels who devote their lives to making the world a better place. And so when it became overwhelming, I would focus on those folks. Our society doesn't do a very good job of finding balance. The pendulum tends to swing. We recognize a problem or something that isn't working the way we think it should and swing wildly another direction. Recently, there has been recognition that there's a problem of mass incarceration, the revolving doors of the prison, and recognition that those who have committed harm and are incarcerated in our prisons most often have a trauma history in need of healing. My prayer is that in meeting the needs and righting whatever wrongs are happening within the system will not be done at the expense of the health and safety of victims, and that we will honor our commitment and our obligation to the crime victims of Washington State. Thank you. I appreciate this from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you for all of your service. Congratulations on the award, well earned. I'm now going to just thank everybody that helped put this event on today. Specifically the 3 agencies, Labor and Industries, Correction, and Commerce. Thank you to all the advocates around the state and everyone who works to help people through trauma. Thank you to our special guest speakers, Dr. Karen Johnson, Professor Meg Garvin, and Jorge Barone. Thank you to the committee that we work, I think we've been working for 4 or 5 months now this year on this regularly. That would include Megan Basquette at the Office of Crime Victims Advocacy, Felita Luna at Corrections, Stanley Phillips from the Thurston County Prosecutor's Office, Kaylee Daly, Danette Racoma, Maddie Brimmer, Cletus Nanabu with Labor and Industries, and Brian Facina with the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. Also want to acknowledge Eric Nelson and Vanny Subramanian with Labor and Industries Design Shop for their work on the Nancy Hawley Award, and Justin Taylor and David Thompson from Labor and Industries for their technical assistance here today. Remember, now is the time. Let's commit to providing rights, access, and equity for all people. And with that, I will say thank you.
you.